Thank you for joining us. It's an
Thank
incredible
you,
year.
Justyna.
Thank you. This year, again, we're going to see record numbers of people fleeing war, persecution, and climate disasters all around the world. The war in Ukraine has led to an unprecedented and the fastest moving wave of refugees, a refugee crisis since World War II. And I would like to start by asking you a few questions about that. Just a small point just a note to the audience. There is a possibility to ask Gillian questions. On your right side, there's a place to type them in, and I'll pose them to Gillian as we move along. What I wanted to ask you first is essentially on Ukraine. To what extent do you think that the Ukraine crisis, the refugee crisis, what has it meant for global attitudes towards refugees, and why?
Well, I think perhaps I could begin by saying that we had been rather concerned in the years leading up to the war in Ukraine, that there was a sense that the asylum system was not working, that the refugee system was in need of reform. There was perhaps a declining belief in the importance of the right to claim asylum. With the Ukraine crisis, we now have of course, evidence of an overwhelmingly positive response by people in Europe, particularly, of course, the border states, Poland, Moldova, and others, but also in other countries around the world. And we have a recent Ipsos survey that's come out today that confirms our own sort of anecdotal and on-the-ground impression, and that is that something in the order of 78% of the 28 countries surveyed say that every person fleeing from war, from conflict, from persecution has a right to claim asylum. So the short answer to your question is we are very encouraged by what appears to be a shift in approach, but particularly in Europe, a shift in approach where people are now opening their borders, opening their doors and their homes and saying, we really want to help these people and protect them for as long as they need it.
Do you think that sense of compassion can be transferred towards refugees coming from other areas of the world into Europe? Because that's obviously been an issue for years.
It is, and that of course is something it's a question we're asking ourselves. We do have other positive evidence. For example, Colombia has offered a 10-year temporary protection visa and a pathway to citizenship to nearly 2 million Venezuelans. We have the hospitality from Costa Rica. We have Bangladesh, with over 1 million Rohingya being held safely in Cox's Bazar and Bhasan Char in Bangladesh. We have Turkey with 2.8 million refugees from Syria into the 11th year. So we do have other very good examples of hospitality, but it's a mixed picture. And some countries, and if I may say so, in particular Europe, there's been a very significant reluctance to extend that hospitality. So we are hoping that the recent response with the temporary protection directive from Europe, from the EU, will prove to be something of a more sustainable nature globally and in Europe itself, of course.
Do you get a sense that the Ukraine crisis and how it, what challenges it has posed, that it has given lessons to governments across the continent in how to most effectively handle such a large refugee crisis in terms of funding, logistics, housing, or perhaps assimilation efforts? I mean, are there lessons to be drawn on these subjects for governments from the crisis?
Well, I think the lessons that can be learned for governments is that they can do this. There was originally a fear amongst European countries that a few thousand coming across the Mediterranean was somehow or another going to put a huge and unsustainable burden. In fact, those very same countries have now taken, and we're not sure of the numbers, but broadly speaking, at least 5 million people. And they are getting them into schools. Of course, over the summer period, there's a lot of preparation for new numbers. The lesson to be learned then is it can be done with political will, and that a blanket protection provision, like the Temporary Protection Directive, used for the first time by the EU, is a very, very effective way of ensuring that protection. And over 3 million people have now applied for that temporary protection visa. So infinitely better than trying to manage thousands and then millions of people coming across the border with some form of individual asylum system. It just simply can't work with very, very large numbers. So I think that that's an important test of what it is that the European countries can do. You've mentioned, of course, other things, shelter. In the shorter term, shelter has been possible because Ukrainian families living in Poland and Moldova and Romania and Slovakia, and then moving into Italy, Germany, France, they have opened their homes, and there has been a huge level of support. But when we know from experience that after a few months, people simply can't sustain it. And that's when the pressure will start to come on local governments in particular, less so at the national level, but usually at the very local level. Local communities and mayors will start to say, look, we're getting people coming to us saying they gave up their spare room or the room in the garage in the back, but they can't sustain that any longer. And I think that is going to be the challenge: accommodation, and getting children into school, and then making sure that the care services, particularly health services, are available. And of course, that all brings significant costs to host countries and host communities.
My next question, actually, do you get a sense that the kind of the real burden or the real difficulty of handling the crisis has been in effect delayed from the perspective of governments or large aid organizations because of this outpouring of help from individual citizens? We're only beginning to see that now in places like Bulgaria, where refugees are being moved away to be housed in a more organized manner. But I mean, is Europe ready for that next wave of having to deal with millions of Ukrainians who might not be able to stay at people's homes anymore?
I think that's a very interesting question, to which we don't have any sort of data to show this. All I can say is that there's a sort of initial stage of the war in Ukraine when many people didn't want to move past the border because they want to go back to their homes and their farms, and of course their brothers, their husbands, their sons are fighting in Ukraine. They want to go back, but we're past the 3-month mark now, and we're starting to see a little bit of that. If you like, the burden, as you put it, passing on to local governments and ultimately, of course, to national governments. I think we will see more of that, but I can say that in the experience of the UN Refugee Agency, we are seeing governments preparing for that. I was recently in Poland and went down to the border. I met mayors, local governments, and so on. There's no doubt that at the central government level, they are working extremely hard over these 3 months before September enrollments at school to build on school facilities, to make sure that schools are prepared. But most importantly, I think possibly even number one being the need to find shelter of a more permanent kind. That's the challenge. And I think you're right to raise the question. We don't yet know how effectively countries are going to be able to do that. And I would think it more likely that better resourced countries in Western Europe are going to be better able to do that than perhaps some of the more fragile countries, particularly Moldova, for example. And some of those border countries are quick to say, well, we're just a transit country. You've got free transport straight out of Poland and Krakow and Warsaw straight into Western Europe, and others will be wanting people to stay.
Do you think that as a result, we might see vast refugee camps kind of crop up around throughout Western Europe, the kind that we have in the Middle East, to handle the Ukrainian, the wave of Ukrainian refugees, or no?
No, I think that's highly unlikely. I think, first of all, we in UNHCR resist camps unless they're absolutely necessary, for example, as they have been in Sudan. But we definitely would not encourage that. And my experience of speaking to government ministers or officials is they have no intention whatever of setting up camps. So I think every effort will be made to ensure that there's emergency accommodation throughout the community, which is by far the healthiest way of giving self-reliance to refugees themselves, allowing them to integrate in a harmonious way with the communities that host them, and they can then be much more engaged and integrated into the communities in which they are.
Following up on that, there's a lot of discussion, particularly across Central Europe, about the kind of the positive economic impact of refugees from Ukraine, that they could possibly plug these vast labor shortages that are plaguing the region's economies. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Is that a good idea, and how can it be done in a way that supports assimilation and this works well for the refugees? Or do you have any areas of concern there, or any challenges that you're concerned about?
Well, we have long advocated with governments that one of the best regular pathways to provide alternatives to dangerous routes for refugees is to provide labor opportunities, and it is perhaps ironic that many countries in Europe actually have aging populations, very high needs for care services in hospitals and care centres, and that they are actually welcoming of refugee families, but because they can meet the needs. Now, one of the elements, as you will all know, is that over 90% of those people moving into Europe are women and children at the moment. So that they will be able to perform, in particular, services like care, health, teaching, some in agriculture, perhaps less so in construction where there are labor needs. Many of these Ukrainian women are in fact well educated, really want to have opportunities. And some governments are now looking at establishing childcare facilities as quickly as possible, so that the women will have some way of caring for their children and then getting out into the workforce. So it's going to vary from country to country. But certainly I can speak for Poland, which will hold, in fact, by probably the largest number of people coming through. They are welcoming of women into the workforce. So it's a very strange outcome of the war at this stage. And I know that some countries will actually hope that when the men come back from fighting this war, that they will be able perhaps to settle in some of these countries for a longer term with their families.
I guess at the moment, data still shows that a lot of these women keep going back and forth.
Yes.
So there's that sense of instability and unpredictability of whether they'll stay in Western or Central Europe, or whether they'll go back to Ukraine. I mean, the kind of the two-way border traffic is incredible still. The border guards in Poland say. Do you get a sense? I mean, what do you think about that? That sense of the refugee situation still being transitionary, women going back and forth. Is that a challenge? Or what kind of challenge would it be?
It is a challenge, and I saw almost the same numbers now coming across the border as we're returning to Ukraine. But then that's why we have to be very careful about citing statistics, although broadly we believe them to be accurate. But there are pendulum movements, and we know how many people that have left across the border, but we don't know how many have gone back but come back again. And some are going back to see what their property's like. Some are going back to bring more relatives or goods across. So there are various reasons. But if I could just give you a very quick example, one family that I spent some time with on the border with Ukraine illustrate the complexity, because it was a grandmother in her 60s who brought her much more aged mother. And she found accommodation very close to the border with a Ukrainian family in Poland and had no intention of moving anywhere else. The woman's grandchildren and daughters had all gone to Germany or to Italy, where the children were there going to be enrolled into school, and they were looking at a much longer period in that part of Europe. Whereas the grandmother that I was actually speaking to then broke down into tears and said she wouldn't leave the border because two of her sons were fighting in the war. So I gave you that example because it illustrates the even in one family, they're being separated, they have different agendas, and the daughters with the grandchildren is primarily concerned about stability and getting the children back into a normal life again. So it's going to be extremely difficult to really understand this highly complex environment of pendulum movements and different objectives and needs.
One of the most closely watched aspects of the Ukraine war is the situation with the Ukrainian grain harvest and what it means for Africa. A lot has been said about how the potential for the war to dramatically increase famine in Africa. What is the UNHCR? What is your kind of black case scenario? What is your biggest fear in that respect?
Well, but most importantly, really, a whole of UN approach to this with the World Food Programme is one of great concern because of the food insecurity that will and is emerging as a consequence of the loss of the wheat, certainly from Russia and of course from Ukraine, because the ports have been blocked in the Black Sea. If those silos of wheat can then be shipped away, that will help. But can I also say that these are very, very complex situations of food insecurity, because you've mentioned Africa. Of course, it's an issue for Africa where it imports its wheat and grains, but also there's been environmental degradation, particularly in the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and parts of Somalia and the Horn of Africa, where they've been subject to very significant drought, and where we have more conflict over resources and over dwindling resources for feeding stock and for planting for the next year. So this is complex, and we can't put everything down to the Ukraine crisis, but fuel prices we know are already going up dramatically, and that is a direct consequence of the closure. But the other consequence, and one that's also deeply troubling for the whole of the UN system and UNHCR in particular, is the loss of financial support, because as you mentioned earlier, the Ukraine crisis has attracted good funding. Countries have been very generous, and individuals have been very generous. The private sector have been generous financially and with goods in kind. But the problem is that many countries, and we fear for the future, that many countries have taken their official development aid and used it for Ukraine, but taken it away from other countries. And I think we all know just how desperate the situation is in many parts of Africa, with conflict continuing, massacre in just the last few days in Burkina Faso, and following one after the other, the conflicts continue, the displacements continue. And that's why we have 100 million people now estimated to be displaced, either internally within their own country or across boundaries as refugees.
I'm getting a number of questions from the audience, essentially about this issue of compassion and economic problems with climate change, but also more specifically, in the very near term, with inflation high across the Western world and still climbing, with this issue of food security. Do you get how concerned are you that this increase in a sense of compassion and welcoming for refugees is just a blip, and that the kind of the anger or concern over refugees taking up resources is going to climb back up again because of what's happening globally with inflation, for example?
Well, you see, it's such a mixed picture. We're seeing this compassion globally for the situation in Ukraine, because it is so horrific, and we're seeing it, and the destruction and the death, and the stories are of sexual violence and rape as an instrument of war. We're seeing this with horror, and compassion is demonstrated by the support that we've seen. But there will be inevitably some level of fatigue. But can I repeat that there are so many countries in the world that have maintained that compassion? I mean, maybe it does dwindle, but the Bangladeshis are still supporting more than 1 million Rohingya. The Turkish government, the Lebanese, the Jordanians, still supporting millions and millions of Syrians as a consequence of that civil war. Uganda opened its borders to people fleeing the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We've seen an end to civil war in Côte d'Ivoire, and more than 310,000 people returning in safety. And there are many other examples that one can cite. So what I'm trying to say is there is a core of compassion that's there. It's not enough. We want to see more, of course, because the numbers are rising. But But I wouldn't say that we see a future in which that compassion dies. You will always get greater compassion within a region, of course, and that's really what we've seen in Ukraine. But the big challenge is to keep that momentum going, and that is a big challenge, because for us to keep giving the public, the media, these increased numbers every year is asking people. People are asking questions. What's happening? Why are we not more successful in what we're doing at the United Nations Refugee Agency? Wouldn't we like to be able to show that these numbers are declining? But unfortunately, they're not.
I'm getting a number of questions on another subject, so I'm going to move away a little bit from Ukraine, a bit to the broader picture, but staying in Europe, Britain and its Rwanda policy. With this expected continued rise in the number of people seeking refuge, particularly in Europe, do you get a sense that, well, first let me ask you, do you think that Britain's plan with Rwanda to send whoever comes across without papers into Britain to be sent into a kind of resettlement camp in Rwanda, is that a viable path? I mean, is this something that we're going to see more and more of in the coming years?
No, I don't think so. And I can answer that question with a little more confidence just in the last few days, when we've seen the European Court of Human Rights give an indication to the British government that the flight to bring the first group, a tiny number, 5 or 7 people, across to Rwanda should not go ahead, pending, and I should stress this, pending a determination on the merits by the British courts, and ultimately, one imagines, by the European Court of Human Rights itself. Can I state as clearly as I can that the High Commissioner for Refugees and all of our colleagues here in the UN Refugee Agency are crystal clear that to shift the burden to transport human beings 6,000 miles away to a poor and developing country with pride in its own sovereignty, but to ask them to take this responsibility on, to shift that responsibility, is in serious breach of international law, and indeed the very law that the United Kingdom has been so instrumental in creating in 1951 with the Refugee Convention at the end of the Second World War, and has supported for 70 years. This is a new development by the United Kingdom, and one that we firmly oppose.
What pressure do you think could be brought on the UK government to abandon this policy?
Well, I think, like all democratic systems, as the United Kingdom is, and of course a global leader with strong democratic institutions, we would expect that civil society, the courts, parliamentarians, the private sector will all bring their persuasive powers to the United Kingdom government to persuade them to return to the values that have really stood as so important to the United Kingdom since the Second World War. We've heard, I don't know that I really need to go into it, but we've heard from the Archbishop of Canterbury, from I think the Bishop of Manchester. We've heard from senior members of society, from the legal profession, from civil groups, from faith-based groups, and scholars. It's been an absolutely consistent response that this approach by the United Kingdom is completely unacceptable, both from a legal perspective, which we would stress, along with a moral perspective. And perhaps I could mention here the Global Compact on Refugees, which was agreed to by the United Kingdom and the overwhelming majority of countries in the world and the General Assembly, that there will be an equitable sharing of the burden and responsibilities for refugees. And that is something that we hope the United Kingdom will be a leader on, but it's actually now, we believe, shirking that responsibility in a way that we find very distressing.
I guess the question is what happens down the line, maybe not next year, in the next 5 years, but in the next 20 or 30 years. And as you've been saying, or as you've said, or as the UNHCR has said, the number of people seeking refuge elsewhere is likely to be rising continuously. We discussed the possibility of setting up camps, possibly maybe at some point for people fleeing Ukraine once kind of the dust settles and we get a sense of how many people actually are in need of housing. But what happens 20 years down the line, 2 decades from now? What are some of the kind of the black case scenarios in terms of the challenges facing Europe that you see ahead in terms of the number of people coming into Europe and what will have to be done to house them?
Well, perhaps we have to begin by acknowledging that almost all refugees want to go home. I think it highly probable that the majority, a significant majority of Ukrainians will want to return to Ukraine. It's a country they love. They have, of course, the bombing in the Donbass region in particular, Mariupol has been horrific. And for people who come from that region, the chances of them returning home within a few years is much more slender, because what do they return to? They haven't got accommodation. But for others, for the whole, I mean, it's a vast country. For central and western Ukraine, it would be easier once this war is over for people to return. And I think it would be reasonable to assume that they will. Also, I imagine that there will be big opportunities for redevelopment of Ukraine once the war is over, reconstruction and rebuilding the society and its infrastructure. Huge tasks ahead. But there will be others, and I did meet young girls, for example, who saw the opportunity to come to Europe and get to university, possibly to work. Those perhaps are people who are going to want to ask to stay longer. But of course, this is a 3-year temporary protection process, so they may not be allowed to stay beyond 3 years, hoping, of course, that the war comes to an end. So we can't see the future. We don't know when this is going to end and what. But one thing is true: the longer people are away from their country of origin, the less likely they are to return. And we're seeing that in Syria or in the Syria context of people in Turkey, for example. They've been there 11 years, they've married, they have children, they have work, they've been well received by Turkey. They're not actually looking to go back to war-torn Syria.
I have a follow-up question to that from the audience. One of the reasons that people flee is, of course, climate change, and those are unlikely to want to go back home at all. So, what is your view? Should there be refugee status for people fleeing their homes because of climate change?
To put on my hat on as an international lawyer, technically, as a matter of law at the moment, and you can tell I'm being a little careful about this, there is no such thing as a climate refugee. Yeah. But, and this is one of the things I love about the law, that slowly courts and human rights UN bodies around the world are slowly starting to see and accept in their jurisprudence that where a person is forced to move as a direct or indirect consequence of climate change, they would be recognized as having fled for reasons that give them refugee status. Now, that is evolving law. But let me give you an example. Let's say Burkina Faso. Environmental degradation, competing ethnic groups for land on which to have their cattle, or dwindling rivers and fighting breaks out over water or access to arable land, and that gets mixed up with ethnic conflicts, and then you have a physical conflict, violence, and then you have people moving across borders to seek safety. So the immediate cause of the flight is conflict, and that would be, of course, a classic refugee situation. But further back in time, a root cause will be climate change. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we will get to the stage where applications for refugee status on the grounds that climate directly or indirectly has caused that flight will become a basis for refugee status. Now, that, of course, adds to the complications that we've already been discussing, and that is rising numbers of people for one reason or another.
Do you think Europe is ready for that? Do you think there is sufficient amount of discussion about what that will mean 20, 30 years down the line and how Europe needs to prepare for it?
I think that before Ukraine, Europe was definitely not prepared for this. And in fact, if I may say so, I think Europe was preparing to resist any increase in numbers. The whole, unfortunately, the difficulties over achieving the pact, the rising populism, xenophobia, misinformation about who a refugee is, mixed movements, because some are not refugees or entitled to international protection. They're economic migrants. We don't make judgments about that, of course, but nonetheless, they're not entitled to the legal protections that a refugee has. All of the indications before the war was that Europe would proceed down that path. And that, I might add, was in relation to a few thousand. Now, post the Ukraine war, I think they are accepting millions, and I imagine that the political environment is one in which they will very rapidly be rethinking what the future is going to look like in response to your question about 20 or 30 years from now. They must plan for the continued movement of peoples, as particularly in relation to climate-related disbursements, but also, of course, we would hope that 20 or 30 years from now we've got better mechanisms for peace. So, we don't know, but my very sincere hope, and I hope I'm not overly optimistic, but that we must, and I think that's the lesson to be learned from 100 million forcibly displaced people, is this is not sustainable. We can't keep doing this. We now need a global, coherent and strong response to peace measures for development, investment, and ensuring that we deal with the root causes of inequality, gender inequality, discrimination, corruption, poor government, all of those root causes that lead to conflict, along with, of course, environmental degradation.
I guess one of the maybe not criticisms, but concerns, or one of the points that has been raised in, across Central Europe over the last 3 to 4 months is that unprecedented outpouring of support for Ukrainian refugees is not matched when it comes to welcoming people from Africa or the Middle East. And I'm just wondering whether that will mean that this new compassion will just stay here, and it will not transform to other countries. But I know you've already mentioned your hopefulness about this.
Well, you're raising something that is raised with us quite frequently. Yeah. Was this just an intra-Europe sort of approach? Understandable, because you always will protect your neighbors and people you know first. No one would want to be critical of that. But inevitably, countries from Africa or the Middle East or the Far East are saying, well, can we expect that extraordinary policy by the EU to be replicated in other parts of the world? And that's why I do want to mention the hospitality from Colombia, from the efforts in Mexico. We expect to see increased opportunities in the United States. It's still one of the most generous countries in the world. It will be taking at least 80,000 resettlement places through UNHCR this year. They are very significant donors to maintain that compassion, if you like. So it's a very mixed picture, but I think we have to advocate and work for those positive outcomes. There will be instances of frankly racist approaches at the border. There will be people who spread misinformation, and political populists who will want to close borders and deny access to asylum. We can't possibly. It's a reality, but we really want to work and advocate for those best practices, and we are through the UN Refugee Agency issuing many examples of good practices that we hope to support with that compassion that you've described.
I wanted to go back to to move towards Latin America, because you mentioned some of the issues a few times. In your opinion, inflation and kind of the economic situation. What do you think that the global inflation, particularly in the Western world, will mean for the economic situation south of Mexico or south of the Rio Grande, in terms of making people migrate? Given that the apprehensions on the US-Mexico border are already at record highs.
Well, that's right, and the concerns of different regions of the world are different. But in North Central America, in particular, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and up into Mexico, and then the U.S. border, and ultimately, of course, the Canadian border, there's a significant movement of peoples particularly because of crime gangs. Governments that simply can't cope or that are corrupted in various ways. So they're rather different problems from one region to another. Yes, inflation as a consequence in part of the Ukraine war will exacerbate the position for vulnerable people the world over. And we'll certainly see that, and we are seeing it in the area of in parts of the Americas. I think it's been very encouraging in recent months to see the Americas come together to try to find some solutions that are broadly hemispheric within the region, that they will work harder on root causes. They will try to get the criminal gangs under better control. They will try to manage food and fuel prices and inflation, but they will do it more jointly. And there is something called the MERPS platform that is in particular designed in North Central America to assist with displaced people. So I think it's encouraging that because the numbers they're moving are unsustainable because of the political situation in particularly the United States, they are looking for more creative solutions that actually tackle the very questions I think most of us want tackled, and that is inequality, poverty, corruption, and so on. So I think that investment in the region by the region is a very strong way forward, along with what in UN speak we talk about as complementary pathways, labor mobility that we've already briefly discussed, educational scholarships, opportunities for displaced people to get into secondary school and tertiary education, community sponsorship programs, relocation of vulnerable families into areas where they're welcome in rural areas often, family reunions, and humanitarian visas, but also fair and fast systems of asylum so that people aren't being detained, as they often are in those countries, awaiting the outcome of asylum claims. We argue for fast but legally fair systems so that those who are entitled to refugee status get it, and those who are not can be returned if necessary against their will.
I mean, I guess the other issue is democratic backsliding that you're seeing in areas of Latin America, and how that affects people's desire to move up north. Would you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, it's clearly a problem and it does come down to poor governance. But sometimes that poor governance is makes it even more difficult for democratic governments or governments that are trying to have the institutions of democracy, but where for economic reasons they find themselves resorting to different practices and weakening the democratic institutions. So in the region, it's a huge struggle to maintain those democratic processes. And it's for many causes, many reasons. But of course, when we talk about the movement of people, I think we have to be aware that most people are not moving. Most people are trying to struggle on in the environment in which they find themselves. Although, from a perspective of the United States or Canada or the European countries or other countries around the world, they might see it as a large movement of people that they really would rather not have to host. The reality is that the numbers are very small, and it remains true that most people displaced forcibly are actually hosted by the poorest or least developed countries in the world. So it's a huge problem at the source of the displacement, as well as these movements of people.
We're coming close to the end of our time, and I have one sort of final question. So the World Refugee Day is on Monday, and I just wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to say what message does the UNHCR want to amplify on that day or share on that day?
Well, thank you. Yes, we do celebrate World Refugee Day on Monday, and perhaps there are two main messages. One is to confirm the key principle that everybody in the world in all circumstances is entitled to make a claim for asylum, a claim for international protection. But the second is that we would like, as a matter of advocacy globally, for us to concentrate a little more on solutions. And those solutions are some that I've been mentioning, labor mobility, education, family reunion, but also integration within the community. And we saw in the COVID crisis that most countries, and it was remarkable to see, and it's an optimistic note on which to finish, most countries included refugees and displaced peoples in their health systems and ensured that they had access to vaccines. Now, we've seen very, very good examples of the compassion that we've been speaking about through this discussion. And it is there for very practical reasons, of course, in a health issue, because as the Secretary General has said, if one person's not safe, nobody is safe. You know, clearly we're so interconnected globally now that we must support each other. And that's really the optimistic message, that we need to share the burdens and responsibilities for people who are forcibly displaced.
Thank you. It's quite a wonderful thing to hear a little bit of optimism. Thank you, Gillian, for joining us today. And I wanted to thank our audience for listening and coming up with some really good questions. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Justyna, and thank you to people listening.